We are live. This is Internal Sadist, and this video is going to be about the I Can Change Him girls. Um, Pretty much, there's going to be a lot of subliminals in this video, so it's going to be heavily subliminal lace. So just follow for all intents and purposes. The funny thing about these type of women or these type of girls, because they're basically girls at this point. Because if they can make poor decisions like this, they're not women. They're girls. These are girls you're dealing with, all intents and purposes. If they can make poor decisions like this, and the sad part about these women is they make so poor decisions, they tend to get themselves into messes that they don't need to get themselves into. Good example of that is women who tend to get themselves into the craziest of situations. Oh, what's up, Sigma? Get yourselves in the craziest of situations. Like a good example of that is women that end up in like abusive relationships. Um, Typically, how it works when a woman ends up in an abusive relationship is she thinks she can change a person. She thinks she can make her situation better as her situation keeps on declining. As you can see, like I used a thumbnail of a woman basically in traction in her own bed for all intents and purposes because she has this dream that she can make it work. And you see how she's all dressed nicely, even for the public, despite the fact that her legs all fucked up. She's basically trying to upkeep an illusion. This is typically what people like this do. Like they could be abused and you would never know they're abused, or they could be abused up until like something big happens to them and they have no choice but to go to the hospital, or you know, until like you accidentally, give somebody a hug and you hug them in the wrong spot, and they're like there's talking about ouch or something like that for all intents and purposes, or if the person can't move their arm. Um, yeah, I know, and it's very irresistible to them for them to actually do shit like that. And the sad part about that is they always end up in the worst predicaments. And I've always had this thing when it comes to women like this. I'm not willing to actually help a woman in that situation for two reasons. I mean, for one reason mainly. One, I'm a firm, staunch believer in your body, your choice. So if you get yourself in that situation, it's your choice, and you need to get yourself out of that situation. And I'm not helping you. This is typically how I feel about it. So I'm not ever going to be a white knight for a woman in an abusive relationship for any reason, because it's not my job. It's your body, your choice. Is basically what I believe when it comes to stuff like that. And the sad part about these women is no matter how much no matter how much the cost is to them mentally, physically, or emotionally, they always think they can change somebody. They always have this notion in the back of their mind that they could change somebody for all intents and purposes. And the sad part about that is they can't. They really can't. And the sad part about that is they live in this unicorns and rainbows fantasy world where like they believe if they just do this or do this right or do this a little bit faster or get this right, everything's going to be perfect. Hence the thumbnail on this lovely video picked for this actual topic. Women have this women have this ability to fantasize about what's actually going on versus what they believe, they have this ability to fantasize about their fantasy on what's going on versus what the reality of what's actually going on. And typically women that work like that tend to be women who tend to always do that. These type of women would try to dress up and still look beautiful as much as humanly possible, or they'll say she fell down the stairs, or she got hit with the door, or the car door, or son threw a toy, or if they have children, or child threw a toy at them, dog ran her over, or they would make up every single excuse to basically justify their relationship. It's typically how it works. The sad part about that is there's a growing number of men who actually do the same fucking thing. But we're talking about women. So the sad part about that is, yeah, and they're pretty much that's the sad part. They still blame men for their screw ups for all intents and purposes, which is actually going to be a part of the next video that I'm actually doing at like about this time midnight, about this time later today, 12 hours from now. But yeah, typically how it works is a lot of these women will blame the other men for their screw ups, like the other men that they're not in relationship with. If they notice something like, her arm's broken or dislocated or she has a bruise, she'll basically make it like it's her fault. Your fault that she's in this predicament, even though you're not the person that she's actually in a relationship with. It's your fault for pointing out the fact that she's getting her ass whooped. That's typically what it is. Like, you're messing up her fantasy. What is your problem? Why are you pointing out her fantasy and her why are you blowing up her fantasy in front of her face? She's not abused. She merely hit the door. That's all it really is. And that's typically how it works. And yeah, it is. Extreme makeover shows are. But the sad part about that is this is women like this are already typically damaged for all intents and purposes. Women who can get into these type of relationships is yeah, and that's typically how it is. And it's typically how it is. And that's basically every if you like I always say, like whenever I do these live streams, there's always a subliminal message behind them. Let it be the avatar, let it be let it be the way I speak, the pace in which I speak, to like the shots that I actually fire that people don't really realize, and all the subliminals that go around it. Yeah, it's pretty much what it is. Because at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, women like this will always blame the men around them and not the actual men they're in a relationship with. It's typically how it works. So when a woman goes, well, it's your fault that this is happening. Okay, I wasn't there. How's it my fault it's happening? Because you said something to him, so it's your fault. No, 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 no. I can say any fucking thing I want to anybody. It's your fault that you're in this relationship, and it's your fault that you got abused. It's typically how it works. And like, women will always blame everybody else outside the relationship and make it their fault, or try to shush everybody down because they'll get their ass whooped by their significant other if they upset him, quote unquote. Because the sad part about that, men like that will abuse the women if they feel upset about their shit, and that's typically how it works. Men in that type of relationship who abuse their women are basically are typically like, most of them raised by most of them have female abandonment issues, where like their mom probably said I'll be back to them, or they were raised by a single mother, or they were raised by a mother who had a revolving door of men, or they were raised by a mother who were the men like this basically are raised by mothers who were either drug addicts, or along the lines. The list goes on for the type of women who raise these type of boys who actually grow up to abuse women. It's typically how it works. Like I said, if a woman's in an abusive relationship, I'm not helping her, because I'm a staunch believer in her body, her choice. It's typically how I operate. So at the end of the day, people fail to realize that when they get themselves in these situations, there's not going to be a bunch of white knights at their rescue to basically save them from their situation. And the sad part about that is that number of men that's willing to help is slowly dwindling for women. It's crazy, but it's yeah. And the sad part about that, eventually, yeah, and it's true that that mainstream media has pretty much done that. The minute it collapses, there's going to be a scramble for women to try to rebuild it, or women to try to fix it, or try to make it work for all intents and purposes. And that's typically how it works. There'll be a scramble for women complaining that it doesn't work. It's kind of like it's basically like a good example of that is the women who are complaining about TikTok going away. Think of it like that. The same women that complain about TikTok going away are the same women who would complain about social media collapsing around them. It's typically how it works. It's kind of like the one thing back in the day, was it Instagram, or another one that was talking about getting rid of the likes. Now, if you know anything about the like system, women enjoy likes. Women want to get more likes than the next woman. Women like that attention, and they love the attention, and they love when they can say they got more likes than somebody else or another woman, for all intents and purposes, because women only post on social media for likes so they can feel good about themselves. That's typically how it works. And the sad part about that is women in these situations, unfortunately, don't have social medias, so they rely on everything that the man says about them to validate them for all intents and purposes. Like their friends can tell them they're beautiful, they can tell them all this other craziness, they can tell them all this other shit, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter. It matters what her man says. And this is typically the women that end up in abusive relationships for all intents and purposes. Because when a woman's in an abusive relationship, she'll tend to she'll basically listen to what the man got to say. Like a man in a woman dating a man in an abusive relationship will hear shit like, you won't be nothing, you ain't shit, you're nothing without me, you need me, the list goes on. He basically demoralizes her and mentally abuses her, emotionally abuses her, and physically abuses her on top of this shit. So she feels like she can't do any better. She feels like she ain't shit, and she's always trying to improve upon herself to actually make it so she can be pleasing in her man's eyes. This is typically how that works. You're in an abusive relationship, honey. You need to get out of it. Because the sad part about that, and the flip side to that, you got women who believe that they look good no matter what, even if their man says they don't. Because everybody else outside the house and on social media says they look good. And this is typically how this works. So women don't seem to understand why their man doesn't like them when they're doing stupid shit, but all the other men on social media like them, because women always try to project the feeling that they're getting from other men onto their man. And the sad part about that is their man and those men are two totally different men. These are the type of men that'll pretty much smash any fucking thing. The men that pretty much will love and like and comment and put hard eyes on a woman on social media are the same type of niggas that'll pretty much smash a hippo. They'll pretty much have sex with a hippo. So I'm not talking about a woman that's a hippo. I'm talking about an actual hippo. These motherfuckers will have sex with an elephant for all intents and purposes. And that's typically how I feel about those type of men that will smash everything. They'll have sex with an elephant or a hippo or a rhinoceros. It's just facts. You may not like it, but it's true about those men. And that's typically the type of men that follow women around on Instagram or Twitch or anything like that. They'll pretty much fuck a rhino, or they'll pretty much fuck a hippo for all intents and purposes. Anybody who has OnlyFans accounts or any man with OnlyFans accounts, any man with Snapchat premiums, any man that has Twitch premiums or Twitch who follows Twitch stuff, they'll pretty much fuck a hippo. Let's just keep it 100. They'll fuck anything with a hole for all intents and purposes. So no, you're not getting the highest quality of people. You're just basically getting a bunch of wallets, which is actually pretty cool to women. But the sad part about that is when a women actually meet the people who follow them, they're sorely disappointed, because they thought all these good-looking men were following them, and meanwhile, it's a bunch of basement dweller motherfuckers who would fuck a hippopotamus if they could, for all intents and purposes. And the sad part about that is this is the world that we live in today when it comes to shit like this. And women think they can change a man that literally just tried to kill them or put them in traction or put them in, some type of harm's way. And the sad part about that is you're not ever going to change a man like that. You're never, ever going to change a man like that. You're never going to fix a man that does shit like that. And you're never going to actually be 100% out of the clear with somebody who's willing to abuse you, misuse you, and mistreat you for all intents and purposes. Because at the end of the day, what you're doing is you're tricking yourself into believing that this is a great relationship and this is how a relationship's supposed to be for all intents and purposes, when in fact, that's not how a relationship's supposed to be. The sad part about that is, don't feel bad, ladies. There are men that do this shit too. There are a lot of men who do this shit for all intents and purposes. And the sad part about that is, when it comes down to it, it's sad for the fact that people think that this is really how a relationship is supposed to be. And this is what a relationship is supposed to be. The sad part about that is, if more women were actually with better men that actually listened to their husband and took cues from their husband, if these abusive women in abusive relationship were actually with men who actually value them and actually listen to what their husbands got to say, they'd be much happier for all intents and purposes, because they wouldn't have to worry about being a beat up or a bruised and hit. Now, the funny thing about that is, when you actually are in traction, It gives you time to reflect on, you know, the mistakes you made as a woman in your relationships. And the sad part about that is this is what usually happens. Instead of actually thinking about maybe they're in a bad relationship, she thinks about what she possibly did wrong to actually make her significant other beat her ass. So she tries to change that, and she tries to change her look, or she tries to dress up differently, or she tries all this extra shit. She tries to wear less makeup. She tries to wear more makeup. She tries to change her clothes. She tries to be sexier. She tries to do everything on time, and she still gets her ass whooped. Like, think about that shit. She does all this extra shit. She goes above and beyond, and she still gets her ass whooped. And the sad part about that, women believe that's what love is supposed to be. Women who were raised by single mothers believe this is what love's supposed to be. Or women that were raised in a two-parent household where their dad beat their mother's ass believe this is what love is for all intents and purposes. Because at the end of the day, if you have to do all this shit, if you have to do all this shit as a man to say that to actually say that you love, for a woman to say that, for a woman to believe it's love, then at the same time you're an ancient man just as much as she's an ancient woman. The woman that's being abused is an ancient woman, and the man that's doing it is an ancient man altogether. But the sad part about that is I'm never going to intervene in those relationships because I'm in the camp of you kind of sort of get what you deserve, or you make your bed, you got to sleep in it type person, and that's typically how I am. If you make your bed, you got to sleep in it. It's that simple. Don't go trying to get me to feel guilty for your stupid situation when in fact you made your bed, now you got to sleep in it. It's typically how I feel about it. And the sad part about that is people always fuck up. People always fuck up a situation that they're in, or make it so that they always trying to paint it in a positive light, despite the fact that you look like who did it, what did it, who ain't gonna do it no more, and we know who did it. But you're trying to always paint it or spin it like you fell somewhere or you tripped while you were running at the gym. Really? So the dumbbells jumped up off the floor and smacked you in the fucking face? Yeah, I believe that. Without you having a crushed skull, right? It's typically how I feel about a lot of this stuff. Now, it'd be one thing if you got accidentally hit by a bar at the gym. That's more believable. But the chance of that happening is very slim, especially if you're in an abusive relationship. I mean, or an excuse that women in these type of relationships will use is that they're clumsy. And the sad part about that, the women who always talk about that they're clumsy are usually the women who actually took gymnastics or ballet or anything that requires a shit ton of balance. You know what I mean? A shit ton of balance and shit like that. They're all of a sudden clumsy and klutzy. Like women who run track and field or run marathons or run basically do cross country running and shit like that are typically the same type of women who get into these relationships then claim that they're klutzy, or that they tripped over something or something along the lines of that. So when I see you running, you were perfectly fine. When I see you doing gymnastics, you were perfectly fine. When I see you doing ballet, you were perfectly fine. When I see you doing dance, you were perfectly fine. When I see you running track or running, a marathon, you were perfectly fine. But all of a sudden now that you're not doing it and stuff, you're all of a sudden clumsy now. Like, how's that work? And it's typically what it is. Like, a lot of these women get into these problems and then they want to get upset by a certain shit, and they want to get upset by a lot of the shit that you're calling out their bullshit for all intents and purposes. And the sad part about that, um, is you run into a lot of problems where, women will always make an excuse for why they're in a situation they're in, or why why men are trash or something like that. Because the sad part about that, they're basically trying to project their last relationship onto men that's not their last boyfriends for all intents and purposes. So these men are trash for the fact that they're not abusing them for all intents and purposes. Just like just like which is pretty much the next live stream I'm coming up in later at midnight tonight, a little after midnight tonight for all intents and purposes. Because at the end of the day, there's a lot of women that put themselves in situations that they don't need to be in, but for some odd reason they believe they need to be there and need to be in that situation for all intents and purposes. Because at the end of the day, once you think about it, she has mental health problems or a lot of mental issues for her to be in situations like that, or for it to be as such for all intents and purposes. Because the sad part about that is there's a lot of women who put themselves in harm's way because they believe That's how a relationship's supposed to be, or that's how their life is supposed to be. And usually women like this tend to have very low opinions of themselves or very low self-esteem of themselves, but this they betray this image that they're high value or high self-esteem. Sad part about that is when they try to portray this image, you can always laugh at them and say you're in an abusive relationship for all intents and purposes. So you can't be high value if you're getting your ass whooped for all intents and purposes. Obviously, you're getting treated worse than a dog or an animal or an abused animal for all intents and purposes. So yeah, and the sad part about that is there's a shit ton of alpha widows in 2007, 2020. There's a shit ton of alpha widows, and it's just facts. Because the sad part about that is there's a lot of women. There's a lot of women who are in relationships now, and abusive relationships, all because her mother was in an abusive relationship, so they believe that this is how a relationship's supposed to be. Yeah, and that's typically how it works. They reject normal order. Like if there's not enough drama or there's not enough drama or there's not enough abuse in a relationship, that means you don't love her as much. It's typically how it works. And a lot of people run into this problem with a lot of women like this for this reason, because you don't love her like her last boyfriend because you don't put your hands on her or push her down those stairs or punch her in the face or put her in traction or abuse her or hit her with a door or try to choke her out. And I don't mean sexually, I mean literally try to choke her out like she's some stranger on the fucking street. Like, the sad part about that is if you don't do any of this stuff, or if you don't cause drama, or if you don't cheat on her, or if you don't you know if you don't leave her stranded some damn where and at night in the middle of a dangerous neighborhood, you don't love her. This is typically female think of today. This is typically the archetypal thoughts of women in this category. This is typically the archetypal. Yeah, these are typical archetypal thought patterns of women in this category. They tend to believe that if you're not doing any of this shit, then obviously you don't love them like you claim you do. Because the sad part about that, to them, getting their ass whooped is love. To them, cheating on them is love. To them, pushing her down the stairs and breaking her leg is love. For them, ripping her arm out of her socket is love. And that's typically how it works for these women. The sad part about that is that's pretty much how they grew up. So they suffer from a mental illness that they need to actually sit in front of a fucking therapist to actually sort the fuck out for all intents and purposes. Because, like you said, some feel like beatings equal love for all intents and purposes because that's how they grew up. That's what they're used to seeing, and that's basically how a lot of people suffer. And the sad part about that is a lot of these women don't even have Stockholm syndrome. A lot of these women suffer from like low self-esteem. They suffer from like depression. They suffer from, personality disorders and shit like that. They suffer from, inadequacy or watching their parents grow up the way they did or watching their mom get abused by random boyfriends. The sad part about that, a lot of these women were actually were rape victims for all intents and purposes, which is actually pretty crazy and funny. Well, it's not funny, but it's like, believe it or not, a lot of these women who grow up in abusive relationships some of them tend to be, rape victims for all intents and purposes that suppressed their rape and never really dealt with it. And the sad part about that is when it comes down to it, women in these relationships don't report the fact that they were raped when they were a kid because they believe that was love. Now let that shit sink in. The reason why they don't report the shit because they believe that was love. And they don't want to get that person in trouble because they love that person. The sad part about that is usually a lot of the times they're still fucking that person who raped them, or they're in relationships with people similar to that man who raped them. Let's just say a good example of that is if the man that raped the girl as a child is in a relationship with her mother, or if he's her stepdad, or if he's her mom's boyfriend, either that girl's fucking her mom's boyfriend or her stepdad, or she's dating men who are similar to her stepdad. And the sad part about that, something that you'll find out about these type of women too, is the reason why they go home and visit their parents, even if there's a step parent or if it's their mom's boyfriend, is because they're basically passing some off to the man who basically raped them or put them in a situation that they're in now. That's typically how that works. That's typically how it is. And the sad part about that is, at the end of the day, if she hasn't, if her mom has the same boyfriend, or if her mom's with the same man that's that helped raise her daughter, and she's always lovey dovey with her stepdad or her mama's boyfriend, they're fucking. They're really fucking. Hate to break it to you guys, but they're really fucking. And the sad part about that is that guy, that guy would always be above you no matter what. Her stepdad or her mama's boyfriend, if she's still with the man, will always be above you if that's the man who basically made her the way she is, for all intents and purposes. Because the sad part of the cold hard reality about it is there's a lot of women who get raped who don't report it because they believe it's love in their mind. They believe rape is love, for all intents and purposes. And the sad part about that, women like that, women like that tend to go under the radar, for all intents and purposes. I'm not saying there's a large substantial amount of women that do that. That's like a minority of women who actually do that. Just But the sad part about that, on the flip side, you got a majority of women who do this shit in the modern age, referred to as Me Too, that'll like pretty much date a man and expect a relationship out of it, and they end up pumping and dumping her and ignoring her. Then all of a sudden it's rape. That's typically how that works. Or my favorite is the guy that looked at a woman outside because she was dressed like a hoe, and she accused him of rape. Despite the fact that he never really touched her, he was accused of rape. Now, the sad part about that is that nigga's name got dragged through the mud, which is typically sad. And it kind of sort of sucks, and it's kind of sort of fucked up how that works at the end of the day. Because at the end of the day, being in an abusive relationship, or being in any type of relationship that you're abused, where you're the abusee, you're pretty much done created a fictional world in your mind that this is how life is supposed to be. This is that unicorns and rainbows shit that I always talk about, or this is that Disney princess shit that I always talk about, for all intents and purposes. Because at the end of the day, nobody in their right mind is going to go out and get into an abusive relationship and or be fucking their stepfather and or their mom's boyfriend if they're in their right mind, typically. The sad part about that is a lot of studies have shown that when it comes down to it, a lot of women tend to not be in the right mind after growing up in a household like that, or growing up in an abusive household, or growing up in a household where they were raped as kids, or growing up in a household where like they get abused by their father, or they get abused by a stepfather, or a woman's boyfriend, or their mother, or you name it, for all intents and purposes, or they get abused by their brother even still. And it's shit like that that just blows my mind. It don't really blow my mind. It doesn't. I don't really find it shocking in the least bit when women get themselves into situations like that. It's typically how it works. But like I said, on the flip side, you got the women who Me Too every damn thing, everybody, because they want to have a stable relationship with that person, and they gave up sex, and they think because they gave up sex that a man's supposed to stay with them. Typically, in a Walgreens world, that's usually how it works. But unfortunately, men are tired of shit, and they're willing to just forego like relationships just to bang your back out, or bang your pussy out. It's all about the pussy, basically. They don't give a fuck what's attached to it, for all intents and purposes. It's typically how it works. On the flip side, to the women who actually get into fantastical relationships of that abuse and rape is love, for all intents and purposes. It's sad, but it happens so much. Yeah, and the sad part about that is I heard of that, and the sad part about that, that's pretty much what's happening. That's typically how that happens. It's basically what I talk about the Disney princess stories, for the most part. Because if you ever look at the Disney princess stories, they start off good, they start off bad, and then they end up in a good situation, for all intents and purposes. So their whole entire belief is that you can go through some hardships and this is good, or you can be poisoned and put to sleep for a while and wait for a prince to pretty much wake you up. Or if your dad dies, you can be treated like the redheaded stepchild, for all intents and purposes. Or just typically all the shit that goes with the shit that's twisted and ridiculous when it comes down to it. Women believe the shit, for all intents and purposes, and they believe, and because they watch these stories, they believe that this is how life is supposed to be. I mean, don't get me wrong. There are some stories like Bambi where it teaches you the life, but like those ones usually get swept under the rug for the Disney princess ones where she's a slave or she's a fucking concubine or she's a fucking she's trapped in a fucking tower or anything simple like that for the most part. Is typically how it works. And the sad part about that, you're right, casual casual bachelor, because at the end of the day, there's a lot of people who are fucked up mentally and programmed to believe this bullshit for all intents and purposes. Hell, it's not just women, it's men too. There's actually men who actually believe this shit, shockingly, believe it or not. And the sad part about that is the men who believe this shit are pretty much trapped in the same damn world as women that believe that abusive relationships and or rape is love. There are a lot of women who actually believe. There's a decent amount of women who believe this shit, who actually are in these relationships. And the sad part about that, there's the same amount of women. There's more women on the opposite side that believe if they have sex with a man, that man's supposed to stay with them. And if the man don't stay with them, it's rape. It pretty much is what it is, for all intents and purposes. There's women on the opposite side believe that if they give up sex, a man will stay with them. And if he doesn't, then it's rape. So on the flip side, you got two ends of the extremes, for all intents and purposes. And I'll bring up more on that one in another live stream or another podcast for all intents and purposes on the women who, on the flip side to this, that believe, if they give up sex. I'll make a podcast on that for a later date and time. So, typically what I'm talking about, there's a lot of women out here who believe a certain thing or believe a certain narrative based on the programming that they went through growing up. And usually it's environmental. It's every now and again it'll be it's either environmental or every now and again it'll end up being hereditary for all intents and purposes. But most times it's environmental, or the way they grew up or the situation that they grew up in. Pretty much is what I'm saying. What I mean environmental. What they see, what they learn, what they picked up, what they didn't learn, what all this stuff is basically all environmental. So the sad part about it, and the cold hard reality of the day is there's a lot of women that are damaged goods out there, and they believe that this is how relationships supposed to work. And if you don't hit them, you don't love them, or if you don't bend them over and rape them or take pussy whenever they don't want it, you don't love them for all intents and purposes. And it's typically what it is. And the sad part about that is, don't get me wrong, there are women that are in relationships who like to be snuck up on, but then there are women that are actually in relationships that don't want that, but they refer to it as love because he's willing to risk. There's a woman actually that was on social media that actually said that he's willing to risk going to jail because he loves you. And this is typically the thought process of women, for all intents and purposes. I'm trying to think of where that video is, or that young girl is that's like 12. I think she's like in her teens, and she actually says some stupid shit like that. Well, if he's willing to risk go to jail to hit you or rape you, he really loves you. That's typically what a lot of women believe in this day and age. And this is typically why a lot of women get into the relationships they do, and why they're unhappy, and why they're carrying around a excess baggage and unnecessary weight. And the sad part about that is, something that I left out about these women is, a lot of these women in these type of abusive relationships, they tend to be better cheaters than their contemporary counterparts. Because the sad part about that is, a woman in that type of relationship, because she's in that type of relationship, she's much able to cheat on a man, for the fact that if she's getting her ass whooped and she's dating, she can pretty much get her back banged out by a coworker, and the guy who's abusing her would not even be any the wiser for all intents and purposes. And the sad part about that is, a lot of women in that relationship end up cheating on their significant others. Even if you're beating her ass or doing all this extra shit, she's usually cheating on her significant others, which is really, really sad, and which is actually pretty interesting. But the sad part about that, when they do it, they end up staying in these relationships while they're doing it, or they'll find a reason to do something to cheat, and then end up and always end up in the relationships that they're in, for all intents and purposes. The sad part about that is, a lot of women tend to get away with doing this, or tend to end up in situations where they don't need to be in, for all intents and purposes, because they believe that this is love and this is how love's supposed to be, typically. And the sad part about that, there, like you're saying, basically, like I was saying, there are gray areas where that's actually acceptable in relationships. Like a good example of that is if a woman's into kink. Um, there's gray areas where that can actually be a thing. And a good example of that is um, pretty much every single woman that I ever dated is pretty much falls into that category of gray area, or what I mean, depending on your relationship, gray area for all intents and purposes. The sad part about that is the women I've always dated, they get turned on when they get scared, or when you jump scare them for all intents and purposes, or when you walk up behind them and just do something randomly out of nowhere to them. They tend to enjoy shit like that. They tend to get very excited and get caught off guard for all intents and purposes. Like I said, I've been known to walk up behind women that I'm in a relationship with, and out of nowhere just haul off and slap the hell out of their ass and just walk off. Um, and like every single woman I've ever dated actually enjoys when I do that for all intents and purposes. At first off, it scares them, it catches them off guard, but at the same time, it turns them on and they start getting very wet. And the funny thing about that, what I've noticed with all the women that I've dated, is when I do that, they get very wet and they get very turned on and they get like it's like a huge it's like a big stimulation to them. It's basically like foreplay on steroids to them for all intents and purposes. So there are women that actually get a kick out of stuff like that. And the sad part about that is it's kind of funny when you're dating for all intents and purposes women who are actually into that type of shit. But the sad part about that is you don't have to go out and actually find a woman. You have to go out and actually get a woman, or if you're. And the sad part about that is usually in a relationship like this, usually when you get into a relationship like this, 9 times out of 10, she likes sex just as much as you, if not more than you. It's typically how it works. And the sad part about that is if you're we'll just say your sex number is at least 4 times a week, hers is probably 7 times a week for all intents and purposes. Or if yours is 3 times a week, hers is 5 times a week, or 6 times a week. And typically this is usually how these women actually work. So they want sex and they think about sex, and that's all they want is sex. But the sad part about that is they're not going to go outside the relationship to get it if you actually do what you need to do in that relationship for all intents and purposes. And it has nothing to do with Dom. It has nothing to do with any of that BDSM, or, well, BDSM is usually a part of, like, there's certain BDSM that women just don't do, and there's certain ones that they do. But the sad part about that, when it comes down to it, it is what it is. A lot of women like this, and a lot of women don't. The sad part about that is, like, there's a lot of men that will say all women like to be choked, when in fact, no, not all women like to be choked. Like, just like not all women like to be spanked, and not all women actually like their hair pulled for all intents and purposes. But men will say stupid shit like this to make it sound like that's not true. Not all women like the shit for all intents and purposes. And the sad part about that is it be saying some shit like if a woman doesn't swallow, she doesn't love you. That's not love. The sad part about that, on the flip side to that, I could say if a man doesn't beat your ass and or rape you, women would say that's not love. If he doesn't beat your ass or rape you, that's not love. And the sad part about that is these are two different schools of thoughts on opposite. Well, they're basically the same end of the spectrum on opposite genders for all intents and purposes. The sad part about that is, at the end of the day, these are literally the same trains of thoughts. Connecting the dots between two different types of people who have the same train of thought, or the same thought patterns, is at both ends of the spectrum. They're not. I mean, not both ends of the spectrum. They're both ends of the spectrum when it comes to males and men and females for all intents and purposes. Because at the end of the day, when the shit comes down to it, if a man can say if she doesn't swallow, she doesn't love you, and a woman can say if he doesn't beat your ass or choke you out or rape you, it's not love. That's typically the same trains of thoughts. You're literally suffering from the same trains of thoughts for all intents and purposes. And the sad part about that is people always try to say, well, no, that's different. No, it's the same fucking thing. It's the same fucking thing. It's the same fucking thing. If a person doesn't like it, a person doesn't like it. You can't say all people like it and then be mad when somebody don't like it. It's typically how it works. That's a good example of that is, a good example of that when they actually talk about when black girls say all black girls give head. No, not all black girls give head. Hell, there's some black girls that don't even want to give head. They just want you to stick it in the pussy and call it a day. It's that simple. They just want you. They basically want you to get the pussy wet so they don't have to suck your dick. Basically, it's typically how it works. There are just like there are a lot of all white women give head. Not all white men actually give head. I know a lot of men who's never had head from their significant others. At the end of the day, for all intents and purposes, not all white women give head. Unfortunately, white women don't give head more than black women, just as much as black women don't give more head than other women. It's typically about the same. There's different models to this for all intents and purposes. There's various models to like this thing. You either got the beta model. I don't mean beta. I don't mean beta as an alpha beta, or you got the model that's ready for the market. Usually, a lot of the men who get women that suck dick are dating the beta model. These are the models still in development. For all intents and purposes, a lot of men tend to get beta models for all intents and purposes. Usually it's still in, it's kind of like beta testing for shit. That's basically the type of women that you're getting for all intents and purposes. It's usually how it works. And the sad part about that is you're right. When it comes down to it, it's pretty much how it works when it comes to women. That's typically how a lot of this stuff works. And the sad part about that is, yeah, and women do have a lot of orgasms in the sad part. And it's typically how it works. And the sad part about that is if you can get a woman to orgasm without even having sex, you've already won the battle for all intents and purposes. Good example of that is slapping her in the ass if she enjoys being slapped in the ass. Or pulling her hair or walking up on her, slapping her in the ass and grabbing her hair and rolling up on her neck and rolling your lips up her neck and whispering in her ear, "I'm gonna fuck the shit out of you later." A lot of women get turned on by that. I've met women who actually have 2 orgasms at one time after being slapped in the ass out of nowhere and being scared shitless and slapped in the ass, and then turn around, you grab their ass and pull their hair, and you run your lips up their neck, and you go by her ear and tell them you're gonna fuck the shit out of them later. She done had an orgasm twice. And the sad part about that, you didn't even have to touch her pussy. You didn't have to touch her nipples. You didn't have to touch her pussy, and she's already wet and she's already ready to go. So now she's in the kitchen making a fuck out of dinner so she can get done with it so she can get her back blown out for all intents and purposes. And it's typically how it works. And a lot of people fail to realize shit like this. But at the end of the day, you don't have to be in an abusive relationship to actually get your rocks off. You don't have to be in an abusive relationship to actually get what you need out of the fucking relationship or get the love that you actually need and the support you actually need. Because if you're in an abusive relationship or you're an abuser in a relationship, that requires you to go get therapy. That's all it really is. That just requires you to go get some therapy and lay on somebody's couch and talk about your fucking problems for all intents and purposes. Yeah, and that's true. A lot of fat women actually do give head because they have to basically go all out to compete with the skinny bitches for all intents and purposes. So that's actually a more true statement than any other person, any other group of people for all intents and purposes for that reason. Because I mean, pretty much fat women will pretty much outpace Asian women in giving head for all intents and purposes. And these go for like the Asian prostitutes and Asian anybody and anybody who always jokes about the sucky long time, that type of woman for all intents and purposes. Fat women tend to give more likely to give head than a skinny woman for all intents and purposes. And it's true because I know a lot of motherfuckers who date fat women who always talk about the head that they're getting from this fat woman. I mean, that's you do you. That's not me. You just get your head and you go do your fat woman type shit. I'm not doing it. I rather find me somebody who's actually into that shit for all intents and purposes. I ain't got no problem with taking my time to find some shit instead of trying to actually invent some shit around some shit that's not even shit for the most part. I'm not willing to take the time and reinvent a woman to my likings. You either got to be my likings or you're not my likings, and I'm not finna put in the work to do it. It's typically how it works. Either you come pre-made or you come fucked up. It's the sad part about that when it comes to women, there's a fundamental difference between a fucking hot dog, a cheap ass hot dog, and a fucking filet mignon. A lot of men date that cheap ass hot dog thinking she's the greatest, when in fact you could be dating a filet mignon. You could be eating a filet mignon instead of a boring ass 58-cent pack of hot dogs. Like, this is where a lot of men get fucked up in. This is where a lot of men fuck up their whole entire thing. And the sad part about that is when they do it, it sucks. And they always get themselves in a situation for all intents and purposes. But that's enough for this video. It's carried on long enough. I'll see you in the next podcast. And y'all have a blessed day. Be good to yourselves. Treat yourselves like milk. Do nothing but spoil yourselves. Improve yourself. Better yourself. And always become the better version of your fucking self. It's typically what I believe on this channel. This is this channel's message. Improve yourself and better yourself. And always take care of yourself and treat yourself. Y'all have a blessed day and be good. And thanks for coming. Thanks, Janky. Y'all showed up late as hell. Y'all showed up late as hell. I'm about to end the stream. But thanks for coming finally. Y'all have a good one and be blessed. If y'all missed it, y'all got to go back and rewatch it from the beginning. Peace.